On today's Murder, She Wrote podcast, we find ourselves, the stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas. We're in Texas. And we're in the hospital where there's fights and funny patients and, of course, murder. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Murder, She Wrote podcast, where I watch every single episode of the hit 80s/90s show Murder, She Wrote, starring Angela Lansbury, a 3-time Academy Award nominee and 5-time Tony Award winner. Today I will be talking about Season 1, Episode 19, Armed Response. Air date: March 31st, 1985. And what a great episode it was. How I arrived at this number is, when the show originally premiered, it premiered as a movie. Then, once that movie was a hit, it became a show. But when the show was syndicated on various networks, the pilot movie was often broken into 2 different episodes, 1 and 2. But the very first episode of Season 1 was Deadly Lady. You look at that, then by the air date of March 31st, 1985, and this is episode 19 of Season 1. As always, if you are new to the Murder, She Wrote podcast, thank you for listening. But I have a tendency to spoil every aspect of the episode. I talk about the murderer, his or her motivation, and every single plot point and every single character. I don't leave anything to chance. That's what you're supposed to do on a podcast. So if you've not seen this episode, or you want to refresh your memory on what happens, then you can go on Amazon Prime and probably find this episode. It's called Armed Response. Or you can go on NBC's app Peacock, where you can watch the show for free with commercials and also watch this episode. Or if you have the DVDs like I do, get out your Season 1 DVD and insert Disc 6, and this is the first episode on that disc. Because from here on out, I'm about to spoil the episode. So here we go. Let's dive in. We started this episode with a man in a limo. This is Mr. Milton Porter, who is a notorious lawyer and is going to the airport to pick up Jessica Fletcher. Jessica's coming to Texas to testify on behalf of her friend who is being accused of perjury, but we unfortunately never know if her friend gets off because we never see her testify. As she's at the airport and they're waiting for a taxi and they're standing there talking, 2 little kids come running up and knocks the bagman down, who then in turn knocks down Mrs. Fletcher. And it's an obvious stunt double. It happened too quick for me to actually be able to do a screenshot of the episode. I tried many times, but you can clearly tell that it's not her. When they do like a wide shot, this woman is completely shorter. Her body type is completely different than Angela Lansbury's. And they were just talking about how often in Hollywood your body double doesn't particularly look like you. And I can understand what they were talking about now, because it looked nothing like her. But of course I know that they're not going to knock Angela Lansbury down. That would not be cool. So, good job, body double. So anyway, Jessica breaks her leg and has to go to the Sam Garver Institute Hospital, which is not like your run-of-the-mill typical like ER hospital. It's like a private hospital for rich people, is pretty much what I'm getting. So Mrs. Fletcher is seen first by Dr. Ellison, who puts a cast on her foot, and Mr. Porter says, "Don't you worry, Mrs. Fletcher, we will sue them. That airport is liable." But it's not, because the kids are the ones that knocked her down. Well, technically the bad guy got hit by the kids and knocked her down. But he's one of those lawyers that thinks that he can get money and you can sue anyone for anything, which is totally true. You can. It was true back in 1985, and it's definitely true now. So Mrs. Fletcher gets introduced to Nurse Jenny Wells, who's one of those nurses that you wish that you could encounter in a hospital, who cares about her patients. And Mrs. Fletcher briefly gets introduced to Dr. Garver, but not enough to really know him. He tells her that she will be in good hands with Dr. Ellison, and Nurse Wells will take her to her room. We then get introduced to Sadie Winthrop, who comes in and has also broken her leg from apparently doing the Texas two-step. And she's going to be a funny patient throughout this episode. While her and Mrs. Fletcher are talking, Nurse Wells goes up to Dr. Garver and says that she really wants to help her patient. He says, "I'm well aware of your patient, Nurse Ellis, and unfortunately there's nothing wrong with him, and I'm not ordering any more tests." She says, "Well, something is wrong with him that won't show up on a chart." He says, "Thank you for agreeing with me," and leaves the room. Nurse Wells then takes Mrs. Fletcher out of the room to her room, and on the way they run into Dr. Wes Kagan. He looks at Mrs. Fletcher's leg, and when she mentions that Dr. Ellison put the cast on, he said, "Well, let me know, because maybe he didn't do a good job. And if you're in any pain, I'll do anything I can." So Mrs. Fletcher goes into her room, and her and Nurse Wells have a conversation, because Mrs. Fletcher's like, why did he get all angry when I mentioned Dr. Ellison's name? She said, "Oh, everyone around the hospital is talking. Apparently Dr. Garver is going to either replace Dr. Ellison or Dr. Kagan, but they don't know which one. And both of them are really good doctors, but they hate each other. They fight constantly." Mrs. Fletcher says, "Oh dear." Later on that night, Mrs. Fletcher goes out of her room to get some tea, but the machine eats her money. So she goes up to another patient named Barney Oberton, who's sitting in the lobby watching television. She asks him if he has change for the machine. He tells her no, and he is very angry and short with her. She says, "Are you all right?" And he says, "Yes, everyone says I'm fine, but I'm not fine. They keep running tests and they have all these doctors around here, but they say I'm fine, I'm okay." And Mrs. Fletcher sort of stands there listening to him, and he goes, "Was there anything else?" And she goes, "Oh, no, sorry I troubled you," and walks away. She then goes up to Nurse Horton, who's the head nurse in the hospital, and she says, "Do you have change for that machine in there? It ate my money and I was wanting some tea." She said, "Mrs. Fletcher, you shouldn't be out and about. We would have brought you tea." She said, "Yes, I know, but I don't want to trouble you. You have so many patients." Suddenly, Dr. Ellison and Dr. Kagan come into the lobby and are arguing about a patient. They then realize people are watching them, and they decide to go into the adjoining office nearest to the nurse station, and they continue their argument inside, in full view of everyone in the hospital. Meanwhile, Dr. Gardner is having a party at his house, which is 5 minutes away from the hospital. We get introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Baker, who serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever in this episode, but are just there. Um, and Dr. Ellison goes to the party, I guess, after his argument with Dr. Kendon, and basically Dr. Garver tells him that he loves his initiative, and we get the sense that he's the one that Dr. Gardner is going to keep, not Dr. Kenyon. The party ends up breaking up. Nurse Wells ends up calling Dr. Gardner and asking him to authorize some more tests for Mr. Oberton, and unfortunately, he says no and tells her not to call him at his home ever again. Later that night, we find ourselves in a security office when alarm is tripped at Dr. Gardner's house. The security guard then decides to go over there and check it out and finds the door ajar. He also runs into Nurse Wells coming from the estate, but doesn't make the connection that it's her just yet. He goes to Mr. Gardner's house, and from the way his house looks, he's rich, and he finds him dead in a fish pond, which is in the house for some reason. But because he was in the fish pond and the fish pond is heated, they don't know the time of death. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fletcher is in, I guess, the cafeteria, and she gets some pancakes. Sadie comes wheeling in and wants some pancakes too, and some coffee. But Dr. Kagan comes up and says that Sadie cannot have coffee because she's too active. She now has to switch to carrot juice. Barney comes up. I can't believe his name is Barney, considering a couple of years from this we'll have Barney the dinosaur. Ugh. Did not like that show. My sister loved it, but it was annoying as hell. But anyway, Barney comes up and he says, Mrs. Fletcher, I do believe I owe you an apology. He said, I'm so sorry. I've been here for several weeks and they have not, I know that something's wrong with me, but they don't know what's wrong with me, and I was rude and I apologize. And Sadie says, why don't you pull up a chair, old Barney? She said, here, have some carrot juice. And he goes, no, I don't want that. Suddenly, Nurse Horton comes running in and says that Dr. Garver has been murdered, and Mrs. Fletcher is shocked. She goes back to her room, I guess, after eating her pancakes, to find a man in the room. This is Lieutenant Ray Jenkins, who has been assigned to the Dr. Garver murder case. He basically asks Mrs. Fletcher for her help in the investigation because apparently he's coming from a bad neighborhood and has never been in a rich neighborhood, so he doesn't know how to talk to people. And at first she's reluctant, but he says, Mrs. Fletcher, your work with helping the detectives is renowned. Please help me. And she says, okay, well, the first thing we obviously got to do is go look at the crime scene. So they go to Mr. Gardner's house, and Lieutenant Jenkins basically tells her where they found his body, and she says, well, that pond is obviously heated for the fish, so there's no way to know exactly when he died. And he said a neighbor heard a shot during the 11 o'clock news. So they're thinking the time of death might be around that time. But other than that, she doesn't have a clue. She goes back to the hospital, and Dr. Edison is out there and says, we were about to send out a search party for you, Mrs. Fletcher. Where did you go? And she said, as you can see, I'm in good hands with my friend here. But she said, but could I trouble you for a ride? My leg is acting up. So he puts her in a wheelchair and is taking her to her room. When she confronts him about the possibility of him being fired by Dr. Garver, he says, where did you hear that? She said, hospitals are like small towns. You hear everything there is to know about everyone. She even talks about how Nurse Wells was having trouble getting tests done for her patient, Mr. Overton. And he says, wow, a hospital is like a small town. He said, you seem to know everything there is to know that's going on around here. He said, but Dr. Garver was a very great man, and it's a shame. Whoever murdered him, he said, I have no idea. Later on, Mrs. Fletcher goes to Barney's room to see him, and for some reason Sadie, I guess, had the same idea, and she wheels in there. And she goes, what exactly is wrong with you, Barney? Because you seem healthy as a horse to me. And he says, and before they go in, a young man is seen leaving, and he says it's his nephew. She says, Mrs. Fletcher says, forgive me for saying this, Mr. Overton, but it seems like there isn't anything wrong with you and you just want to stay here. And Sadie agrees with her, and he says, well, my wife died several years ago. We had no children. I have no family. And Sadie goes, well, do you have any friends? And he said, no, not really. He said, and I know that something's wrong with me. And Sadie says, there's nothing wrong with you. You need to stop sitting around here moping. You need to go out and live your life the way that God intended. She said, there's nothing wrong with you. You know what? Me and Miss Fletcher here, we're going to go out and chow down. And if you can turn your frown upside down and stop moping around and feeling sorry for yourself because you don't have anyone, then maybe you can come out and join us. But until then, we don't want to see your sourpuss around, because if you want friends and if you want someone to like you, you have to put yourself out there every once in a while. And her and Mrs. Fletcher leaves. Mrs. Fletcher then confronts her and says, don't you think that was a little harsh? And she says, oh no, he needed it. He needed that push. He was just like my ex-husband, always feeling down in the dumps about stuff he couldn't control. But he needed those words of encouragement, believe me. Suddenly, Mrs. Fletcher looks out the window and sees that Nurse Wells is being led away in a police car. She walks away from Sadie and goes downstairs into the lobby. She demands to know what's going on. Lieutenant Jenkins tells her that the security guard possibly identified Nurse Wells coming from Dr. Garver's estate. Dr. Ellison tells her that him and Dr. Kagan are now going to run the institute together because that's the way that Dr. Garver would have wanted it. Mrs. Fletcher then calls Mr. Porter, asking him to represent Nurse Wells because she knows that she did not kill Dr. Gardner. She was just trying to get him to do some tests for Barney. And reluctantly, he agrees after Mrs. Fletcher brings up the fact that she came all the way to Texas to testify for her friend and she didn't have to. So he agrees to go ahead and take the case for her. Meanwhile, she gets off and everything is fine, and she asks Lieutenant Jenkins to take her back to the crime scene because she's confused about something, and she wants to re-look at it, re-examine it. On the way there, there's more evidence against Nurse Wells because Dr. Garver duplicated his notes on his answering service, stating that Sadie was supposed to have carrot juice from now on because she had too much caffeine, and that Nurse Wells was getting on his nerves and he was thinking of firing her. Mrs. Fletcher and Lieutenant Jenkins arrive back at Dr. Garver's house, and she wants to do an experiment to see if the neighbor here heard 2 shots or 1. The neighbor is really strange as she thinks that she's on a game show. She goes, you know, I almost was on The Price is Right, but for some reason it fell through. And then she goes, you got hidden cameras somewhere? What do I win? What do I win? And it's like, what is going on here? Like, I didn't understand that part either. I mean, between her and the strange couple that doesn't seem to have a purpose in the episode, um, which they show up again at the hospital. Apparently something is wrong with Mrs. Baker, but it's not abundantly clear, and she goes, it's not going to be the same without Dr. Sam. And like I said, they make no sense. Anyway, Lieutenant Jenkins fires his gun once in the house and once outside, and the woman next door says, yep, I heard it, just the same as I did that night. What do I win? And Lieutenant Jenkins says, I actually fired 2 shots, ma'am. She said, oh, I got it wrong. Do I win something anyway? Like, I don't understand. I don't get this woman. So Mrs. Fletcher goes back to the hospital and she talks to Nurse Horton, who, to get some more background on Dr. Garver because she didn't really know him, Nurse Horton clearly, was in love with the guy, and as far as I know, he wasn't married. And she does admit she had a crush on him, but he didn't know. And she says he was a prominent position and a really wonderful doctor who cared about his patients and cared about this hospital. Suddenly a random nurse comes in and says that the police have a search warrant and are searching the nurses' lockers. Nurse Horton and Mrs. Fletcher go into the locker room, and Mrs. Fletcher's like, Lieutenant Jenkins, what are you doing? He said, we have a search warrant to search Miss Wells' locker, and they find the gun in there. This is shocking, and Mrs. Fletcher says, she did not do it, I'm telling you, she didn't do it. And he said, well, this is obviously the murder weapon. And then she says something hilarious. She says, of course it's the murder weapon, Lieutenant. Have you ever heard of anyone framing someone with the wrong gun? I laughed so hard when she said that. It was so funny. Oh my goodness. Nurse Wells is now arrested again and charged for the murder of Dr. Garver. She goes straight to Mr. Porter's office, and he agrees again to represent her. And suddenly Dr. Caden comes and says, the hospital's behind Nurse Wells 100%, and we are going to pay for her legal fees, and even hands over a check to Mr. Porter. And Mr. Porter's like, oh, I'm definitely taking the case now. Because he's that kind of lawyer. Mrs. Fletcher goes back to the hospital and goes into the cafeteria where Barney and Sadie are playing gin. They seem to have become sweet on each other and are on the verge of becoming a couple. Mr. Barney seems more happy and upbeat, and Sadie and him are playing gin when Mrs. Fletcher sits down. That's in your visual aid because it was a funny scene. Mrs. Fletcher has her hand on her face because she's just so happy that the two got together and that they found happiness in each other that they did not know could exist. And I'm kind of like that too. I try to, make people happy as much as I can because it makes me happy. And a random nurse comes by and asks if they would like something to drink, and Sadie says, yes, I'd like a coffee, make it a double. And he says, no, remember, Dr. Kagan said that you are supposed to have carrot juice. And he said, and give me a carrot juice too. He said, I'm starting to like that stuff, it's really good. She goes, you would, this stuff is the pits. Martha Ray is so funny. Suddenly Jessica has her epiphany moment, and she slowly leaves them alone, and they're planning a trip together, like a cruise or something. And then he goes, was it something we said? And she goes, I don't know, that woman is always running off doing something. So suddenly we find ourselves in the lobby again, and Lieutenant Jenkins is confronting Dr. Ellison, saying, "This is your gun." And Dr. Kagan says, and Dr. Ellison is saying, "No, it's not my gun." And Dr. Kagan says, "Yes, you told me that you carry a gun in your car." And he says, "Well, I told you a lot of things that weren't true." So Mrs. Fletcher comes into the lobby and she says, "Lieutenant Jenkins, what in the world are you doing?" And he says, "You told me that this is Dr. Ellison's gun." And she said, "I certainly did not tell you that was his gun. I suspected it was his gun. Let's go talk in this office over here." So they go into the office. Dr. Porter's there, Nurse Wells is there, the two doctors are there, Nurse Horton is there. Everyone is, and that random couple from Dr. Gardner's party is there too. I don't know why. They just randomly showed up and are standing there. Like I said, they serve no purpose. So they are arguing in the room, and Mrs. Baker says, "She seemed like such a sweet lady." And it's like, how do you know? You did not have a scene with her. I watched this episode all the way through, and they never even interact with each other. So how does she know she's a sweet lady? It's really weird and confusing. But anyway, Mr. Porter says, "Wow, that lady definitely has some spunk." And Mrs. Fletcher comes around the corner and says, "Thank you, Mr. Porter." And he goes, "Well, what in the Sam Hill?" And suddenly, there's so many daggone doctors in this episode. Lieutenant Jenkins comes out, and him and Mrs. Fletcher recorded their argument. And she says, "I know exactly she says, "Isn't this the same scene we witnessed the night that Dr. Gardner was killed, Nurse Horton?" She said, "Exactly the same, it seems." And everyone's like, "Well, what does this have to do with anything?" And she says, "Well, Dr. Kenyon, you gave yourself away. You switched Sadie with carrot juice, though on Dr. Gardner's orders, but no one had heard that tape. The only person that would have known about those orders was the person who killed him, because he was saying it into his answering service before he was murdered. So you had to have murdered him, Dr. Kagan, because no one knew that he wanted Miss Winthrop to drink carrot juice." At first he denies it, and then she turns to Dr. Ellison and says, "Why don't you tell us what happened, because you were in on it with him?" Dr. Kagan immediately says, "Shut up, Ellis. Don't say anything. They have no proof." And yet they're standing right there in front of everyone, okay? So when you immediately start talking and say, "Oh, don't talk. They don't have any proof," that's all the proof they need right there. Because you're telling him to shut up and to not tell him. Obviously it's true, but he tells him anyway. He says that it was all Dr. Kagan's idea. Dr. Kagan stayed after the party was over, went into Dr. Gardner's study, and after he finished duplicating his notes onto his answering service, he shot him. He then threw his body into the fish pond so that no one would know the time of death, and then left and went back to the hospital. Then him and Dr. Ellis staged the argument between each other, playing it on a recorder. While everyone was focused on that, Dr. Edison slipped out, went to Dr. Gardner's house, tripped the alarm. Because Dr. Kagan said it before he left, because I guess he knew the code. Then Dr. Ellison tripped the alarm and fired a shot into the night to alert the neighbor, and then was able to slip back in time to leave the office when the argument was over. They decided to frame Nurse Wells because she was the perfect scapegoat due to her ambition of wanting to help her patients. So she gets cleared of all charges. Sadie and Barney are on the road to probably getting married, and Mrs. Fletcher is on her way to the airport to go back to Cabot Cove when when Mr. Porter comes. The motivation for the two doctors for doing that was that one of them were about to be fired, so they decided to put their differences aside and kill Dr. Gardner instead so he wouldn't fire either one of them. Doesn't look like it worked out in the end for these two, huh? And anyway, Mr. Porter comes and says, I can still go after the airport for you. And she says, no, that's not necessary, Mr. Porter. And he says, well, I just took on a case. I can't do it anyway. 2 prominent doctors kill their boss. She said, you're not going to be able to win that case. He said, well, I'm sure going to try. And she's like, well, I'm going to go. He says, Mrs. Fletcher, that's all you have to say to me after everything we've been through? And she goes, well, there is one more thing, Mr. Porter. See you in court. Well, guys, this episode had a lot of people in it. It was very clever, the way that they had her break her ankle at the beginning of the episode to get her in the middle of the hospital to be able to solve this crime. It was interesting. There wasn't a lot of twists and turns like in the other episodes I've covered, but it was pretty interesting. And I recognized some of the guest stars, but not all of them. Let's see. Barney was played by Eddie Bracton. And I recognized him right away. I think he guest starred on The Golden Girls as Eddie. He died in 2002 at the age of 87. Oh, I just recently saw him in this. He's known for Home Alone 2, Lost in New York as Mr. Duncan. I knew I recognized him. He's also known for Hail the Conquering Hero, National Lampoon's Vacation, and The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. He was in 79 different things. His last known credit was a TV series called Ed in 2000. He guest starred on Empty Nest, Wise Guy, The Golden Girls as Buzz. I knew I'd seen him on The Golden Girls. This is his only episode of Murder, She Wrote, unfortunately. He guest starred on the 20th Century Fox Hour, and was in a lot of, he was in one of my favorite Judy Garland movies, Summerstock. So he was in a lot of MGM musicals and stuff. He had a really long career. He was really funny. He was really funny in this. Melanie Baker, the random woman that served no purpose in the episode, was played by Victoria Carroll. I mean, that's the one part of the episode I did not like, was I did not get what her purpose was in it. She's known for the Kentucky Fried Movie, How to Stuff a Wild Bikini, Nightmare in Wax, and the Incredible Hulk cartoon series. She's still alive. Her last known credit is 2013's Fortune Son. I don't know. She did some voiceover work for the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. She was in the TV series Problem Child, The Story of Santa Claus. She's done a lot of voiceover work because she had a funny southern voice in this. She got started on Highway to Heaven, Night Court, did some voiceover work for the Smurfs and Scooby-Doo. She was on Three's Company, Alice, the original Dynasty, original One Day at a Time, the Waltons, Fantasy Island. And this is her only episode of Murder, She Wrote. Alrighty then. Our murder victim, Dr. Garver, was played by Stephen Elliott. He died in 2005 at the age of 86. He's known for Beverly Hills Cop, Arthur, the original Death Wish, and the $6 Million Man. He was in 121 different things. His last known credit is Chicago Hope as a judge. He was on the original Law and Order, Columbo, Trial and Error, Hotel, the original Dallas. He was in a Perry Mason movie, The Case of the Lost Love, Scarecrow and Mrs. King, Highway to Heaven. This is his only episode of Murder, She Wrote. Saint Elsewhere, Maximum Security, Hardcastle and McCormick, Magnum P.I., Falcon Crest, that was a good one, Quincy M.E., Heart to Heart, Vegas, Greatest Heroes of the Bible, the original Hawaii Five-0, and How the West Was Won. So he had quite the impressive career. You go, Mr. Elliott. One of our murderers, Dr. Wes Kagan, was played by Sam Groom. He's known for Outer World, Police Surgeon, One Life to Live, and Our Private World. He is still alive. His last known credit is One Life to Live. He was on the original Law and Order. He was on one of my favorite soap operas, Another World. This is his only episode of Murder, She Wrote. He was on the original Love Boat, Hill Street Blues, Quincy M.E., The Bionic Woman, Police Surgeon, I've never heard of that, Gunsmoke, All My Children. I loved that show growing up, Our Private World, and The Edge of Night. So he had quite an impressive career. Lieutenant Ray Jenkins was played by Bo Hopkins. He looked familiar to me. He is still alive. He is known for Midnight Express, The Wild Bunch, American Graffiti, and The Getaway. He is still acting to this day. His last known credit is Hillbilly Edgerly in 2020 as Papal. He will be in another episode of Murder, She Wrote. He was in the original Dynasty. That's what I think I recognized him from, because I saw... And, also Smoky Mountain Christmas with Dolly Parton. Yeah, that's what I recognized him from. Scarecrow and Mrs. King, Deadly Nightmares, Fantasy Island, Charlie's Angels, The Rockford Files. So he's had a long, impressive career being in 132 different things. You go, Mr. Hopkins. He's a good actor. And our other murderer, Dr. Ellison, was played by Martin Kove. He is still alive. He is known for The Karate Kid, Parts 1 and 2, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, and The Last House on the Left, the original. He's still alive, and he is still acting. Apparently he's going to be in a TV movie called Echo One, Hollywood Land of Hopes and Lies, Dante's Hell in 2021. So he's still acting to this day. He was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood just recently. He was in The Dog Who Saved Summer, Criminal Minds. Love that show. Because he's been in 227 different things. Wow. He's been acting a lot. In a lot of things. Diagnosis Murder. Hercules, the legend continues. Walker, Texas Ranger. Gambler 5. Blake's Law, Tales from the Crypt. Cadney and Lacey. Twilight Zone. The soap opera Edge of Night. And this is his only episode of Murder, She Wrote. But he's had quite an impressive career. And he's still going strong. You go, sir. The person who was accused, Nurse Wells, was played by Kay Luntz. She is still alive. She is known for House, Breezy, Midnight Caller, and Reasonable Doubts, which is a TV show. She is still acting. Her last known credit is The Downside of Bliss, which was released this year, and she's in post-production for something called Sallywood. She did some voiceover work on Adventure Time. She guest starred on Bones, CSI, the original CSI, Cold Case, love that show, NCIS, House, Heartland, JAG, Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, Once and Again, ER, Touched by an Angel, Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, Midnight Caller was a TV series apparently, Simon and Simon, Charles in Charge, Death Wish 4, Hotel. This is her only episode of Murder, She Wrote. And she also guest starred in Cadney and Lacey and Magnum P.I. Interesting. She had quite the impressive career, and she's still acting to this day. Good for her. And Mr. Porter, the annoying lawyer, was played by Kevin McCartney. Or McCartney. He died in 2010 at the age of 96. He's known for in the original Invasions of the Body Snatchers, UHF, Inner Space, and the remake of Invasions of the Body Snatchers. So he starred in both of them. His last known credit is The Ghostly Love of Johnny X. He guest starred on The District. He was in Addams Family Reunion as Grandpa Adams. He guest starred on Tales from the Crypt. Did some voiceover work for Batman the Animated Series, and he will appear in a handful of other episodes of Murder, She Wrote. Awesome. Good for him. So maybe we'll do some fun facts about him a little bit later. And Susan Oliver played Nurse Horton. Let's see what she's known for. She unfortunately passed away in 1990 at the age of 58. She is known for Star Trek the original series, Magnum P.I., The Fugitive, and The Man from UNCLE, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Her last known credit is Freddy's Nightmares as a maid. She also guest starred on Simon and Simon, Magnum P.I. She'll appear in another episode of Murder, She Wrote. She was also on Days of Our Lives as another person named Horton, as Laura Horton. Interesting. And last but certainly not least, Martha Raye played Sadie Winthrop, and she was a hilarious woman. She unfortunately died in 1994 at the age of 78. She starred in several MGM musicals. She's known for McMullen and Wife, Billy Rose's Jumbo, Weeky Wedding, and Give Me a Sailor. Her last known credit is the TV movie in 1985, Alice in Wonderland. Unfortunately, this is her only episode of Murder, She Wrote. Wish she could have been in more. She also was on Alice, The Love Boat, McMullen and Wife, The Concorde, Airport 79, which is so funny. Her line of, "The bathroom broke," was hilarious. I know she did several guest spots on The Carol Burnett Show. She was so funny. I loved her in this episode. I wish she could have been in more Murder, She Wrote episodes. And that's it, guys. I really loved this episode. I want to thank you all for your continued support in Jessica Fletcher, Murder, She Wrote Facebook group, and all things Murder, She Wrote. Especially the commentary on that you all have done, which I'm going to go over your comments. Let's see. In Jessica Fletcher, Murder, She Wrote, Charlotte said he went from the police to priest, and she's talking about how Tom Bosley went to do the Father Downing mysteries. Bradley says, contender for best episode ever. I don't know if he's talking about me or if he's talking about the episode from Murder, She Wrote. And then Carol Ann said, this is my very least favorite episode. It has no great qualities in my opinion. So that's awesome. And I love your all's comments. In all things Murder, She Wrote, someone said, I think her name is Maddie, and if I got your name wrong, I apologize, said, I love this episode, thank you. And you're very welcome. Thank you for your kind comments and your support. I appreciate it more than you'll know. I have 2 more episodes of season 1, guys. I can't believe I'm almost done. Thank you for your continued support. Happy crime solving. I'll see you in the next one. And happy holidays. Merry Christmas.